Welcome to the John Harrison Podcast. Do you realize that 70% of people are disengaged at work? I don't think it's an overstatement to call that a tragedy, actually, because it affects the bottom lines of organizations, certainly, but it has a negative impact on all the people that work there, and their families, and the community at large. Nobody's talking about this. Well, on this podcast, we are going to talk about it.
Hi, welcome back to the John Harrison Podcast. I'm your host, Tanner Hubbard. Today I've got John and Melissa here, and we're going to talk about having resilience in the workplace and what that looks like. This is similar to an episode we've recently dropped just about how to bounce back from setbacks that we encounter. But this is maybe more of a long-term continual thing, that resilience word that we've probably all heard. We've recently just done some new content around this, actually. We facilitated a 8-week webinar series about different characteristics of what we think a star employee is. This was the first one that John hit in that series, and so that is just a little shameless plug there. That is content we have that we can do on-site with companies as well if you're interested in that. But in this free podcast, we're just going to talk about our thoughts around this a little bit, give some examples. So, John, I know particularly in your world at Caterpillar, this is something you saw either in a positive way or people that lack this kind of resilience that's necessary in good employees. So tell us a little bit about your experience there.
Yeah, thanks, Tanner. I think, as Tanner said, I've had people ask me, what's a star look like? And one thing that came to mind instantly was resilience, just thinking of real people that I worked for, whatever. And I think we've got to be careful today because sometimes you can get older folks that are like, man, we were resilient. We dealt with all this stuff, and these young people can't handle life. And, we had 8 kids and they had 1, and what's their problem? And so I think we have to watch that a little bit to not just put that on everybody. But I also think I think human beings are capable of more than we think. And so sometimes we can easily get into a cycle of I'm tired and I've got too much to do and I just can't handle it. And I think, for the long haul, resilience to me means you are going to have these bumps in the road. As we talked about in our last podcast, you're going to have bosses you don't like, you're going to have peers you don't like, and that you're not letting those things derail you, so to speak, to where you can't recover. And I'm just going to say this. I was interviewing a person when I was at Caterpillar, and the person was kind of sheepish about this in the interview, but he said, I'm just going to tell you, I flunked out of college. Like, my parents wanted me to go into engineering school, and I didn't want that, and my grades reflected that I didn't want to be there. And he said, I got kicked out, and I flunked, and I had to kind of go home with my head held down to my parents' house. I had to live with my parents. My dad made me go to a kind of a small school, just driving distance from our house. I went into accounting, and he ended up getting a 4.0 in accounting, and I was hiring him for an accounting job. And so I'm not saying that's a better story than somebody that never had a setback in their life or just got 4.0 all through school. But I'm telling you, I've never forgot that because he didn't let that kind of derail him. So I think it's just a matter of there's the resilience just through daily practice, things that are going to come up during the day that frustrate you, traffic, whether your spouse or your kids or your boss, but also longer-term resilience. And I think companies are looking for people that can weather the storm, so to speak. And I think that doesn't mean you work 80 hours a week and you never show any emotion, but it also doesn't mean that you're feeling defeated every time there's a bump in the road.
Well, I love that concept, and that's something we've worked with clients of ours, and we help them with the robust hiring process. And I know Melissa has some examples of that, both personal and professional, to share on that. But when we're asking these situational behavioral questions to help identify, an applicant's potential values, and if they align with the company's core values, we're not looking for those perfection examples like you just mentioned, John. We're looking for how they handled a frustrating situation or a time when they were disrespected. We don't really care, not to sound heartless, but we don't really care what the situation was, but more how did they handle that and how did they come out of that? Yeah, exactly. So, and Melissa, I know you have a personal story too, but what's your thoughts on this, the resilience in the workplace or personal life as well?
Yeah, I think resilience can look different for different situations. If you're talking about more severe situations like a death in the family or loss of job or financial issues or, things like that, it's just going to look different. There's different emotional components to that. But so I have a friend that has been laid off actually from the same company twice. She then moved to a different industry. And due to contracting and how things were written, they were able to take their business from the company that she was working for to someone else pretty quickly, which left them in a conundrum. So she was laid off from that job. And now she is working with another company, and very strong potential for the exact same thing to happen. But one of the things that I've seen in her that I truly admire just over and over is her resilience, because not only did she continue with, her job search and her life, she never gave up her home, she never gave up her car, but and we talked about this a little bit in a previous podcast, but she surrounded her people with supported her not only emotionally, but also helped her out, sometimes financially. She continued to look for jobs. We tease her somewhat and call her a professional peddler, because she always found side jobs, and it didn't matter if she was cleaning houses or babysitting or, what she was doing. She did what she had to do to make ends meet. And I think tenacity goes along really well with resilience, and that is one thing that she has both of those very strongly. But, just finding a component of all those things together to help get you through those situations. And again, it's going to be different depending on what it is we're talking about. I've experienced a death in my family. My mother passed away. We've all lost parents and people that are close to us. Knowing what your boundaries are in emotional spinning situations like that, asking for time off, asking for the support that you need from your employer. I don't think there's anything wrong with that. But the key thing you have to keep in mind is you can't live in that state forever. You have to move through it, not past it, because it's always going to be there, but you have to move through it. And I think that's a really key piece of resilience.
Yeah, no, I think you hit the nail on the head. That maybe defines resilience better than any other way you can talk about it, in that it doesn't mean the situation wasn't hard or isn't hard, but it's kind of not allowing yourself to have that woe is me mindset. Again, it doesn't mean you're ignoring it or pretending like it didn't happen. You're working through those things. But people who maybe aren't resilient, you can see in their reaction to hard times, tragedies, things, because that's their new normal, as they bottom out there. There's like, somebody better come pick me up off the floor. And like John alluded to earlier, that can be a trait of younger generations now, because I think they've seen that be acceptable at times. And we're kind of allowing that to happen, where now it's like, all right, well, I'm having the worst day ever. Somebody better come, make me feel better. This company sucks. Somebody better make it better. Right. And there's no real ownership to the resolve there. And I think that's where the resiliency factor comes in, is allowing yourself to continue moving forward, and continue to keep your head above water, kind of like your example of your friend, even when those times are tough. Because let's be real, it's easier to help people who are helping themselves. So when you're talking about that community around you, nobody wants to, I'm not trying to step on anybody's toes on our podcast right now, but nobody wants to keep being there for the person who's never there for themselves, if that makes sense. But somebody who's doing their best and is there for you when they can be, that's somebody who, you're like, man, I want to help them out. I want them to succeed. So I think that's a great example. What are some other maybe tips for folks who resilience isn't a strong suit or is something they want to get better at? What's something you've seen either personally, professionally, seen other people do well? What would be some tactical tips to somebody who wants to practice resilience in their life?
I think sometimes you just have to go back and look at things you have overcome, right? And we've all been through things at the time we thought was like when you learned how to drive, or, took tests at school, or had to get up in front of the room and give a speech. Or we can all look back and go, that was the most stressful time of my life. And now we look back and we go, what was I talking about? Like that, man, I would love to go back in that time because it was not very stressful. And so we have overcome, even illnesses. And I think when you're in the middle of it, Jen and I try to have this approach, because people get up in the morning and let's say they have a cold or a flu. And they're like, really? Me? Why me? Why me? Of all days, I've got all this going on this week. Thanks, now I've got, thanks God, I got this flu this week. Instead of thinking, man, I'm probably healthy 360 days a year. And I think people that are resilient keep that in mind. It doesn't mean everything's rainbows and unicorns, but this too shall pass kind of thing. And we can all go back and say, man, I thought this, again, I was never going to overcome this. I was never going to get out of it. In the middle of having the stomach flu, man, it was so awful. But all of a sudden, just, you get healthy, and the sun comes out again. And I think not forgetting that stuff is really important, because there's people that kind of catastrophize and they live in the next drama that's coming towards their life.
Yeah. And I think we'd be remiss if we didn't mention personalities, because they come up in every single one of our discussions. But, as life evolves and you move through things in your life and things influence you and impact you, they help change you and evolve you to different levels of maturity and understanding and judgment as well. And I think, just knowing that there are tools out there or people out there that can help you understand yourself better, whether it's a counselor or a friend, or, even a tool like the personality assessment we use. Some people would argue your personality never changes. I don't think the core of who you are changes, but how you respond to those things and how you process them changes. So just looking at some of those tools to reevaluate and better understand yourself. Of course, personal counseling, seeking out the need that you have specifically for that situation that you're in. But those are just two things that come to mind for me. And I speak about the personality from personal experience, because if I think about who I was in business 25 years ago, I am a whole lot different in how I process information 25 years later. Yeah, that's good. And all of those things feed into that.
And it was interesting, before we started today, Tanner's got 3 small children, and he's not sleeping a lot at their house. And it's not helpful for Melissa and I, who have been through that, to go, well, Tanner, suck it up. Like, you won't even remember this one day. Because at the time, it's a physical toll, it's an emotional toll. But what is interesting, with my girls all being 25 and older, if you ask me, hey, do you remember that time you couldn't sleep all night? I would go, no. I have zero recollection of not sleeping. And I have zero recollection when, they were really misbehaving badly. And so there is that balance. Let's not sugarcoat and go, no, you'll be fine, just get over it. But also realizing you are going to get through this. And no one would say, most people would not say, you know what, we shouldn't have had these kids, because I like my sleep. Because when the kid, now you go, I can't even imagine life before these kids, or even getting married. Then Melissa's daughter just got married, and my daughter's getting married. And you could say, it's all this Cinderella stuff. It's like, no, marriage is going to be really hard. But most people at the end of their time together go, we should have never done this. Like, we should have just stayed single, not get married, not had kids, not done this, because it's all the positive outweighs the difficult stuff. And the last thing I'll say, your kids, those of you that have kids, they're going to come home and say, I don't like my teacher. I got bullied a little bit today. I've got 6 tests due this week. And again, as parents, you don't generally just say, suck it up, buttercup. But you also know, well, that's part of growing, and you can't quit. We're not going to just pull you out of school at 3rd grade and never have you go to school or class again. Like, you're going to have to do this. So I think some of the things we might teach our kids, we probably have to remind ourselves that you can't quit your job every time things get tough, and you can't just melt down, and that kind of thing too. It's just part of life.
Yeah. That's always a balance, and that's a good lead into kind of my one tactical thing I wanted to share is just something I've found helpful in my own life during those tough times, and this can be at work or at home, but particularly at work. I would say is reminding yourself kind of why you're doing it. Y'all mentioned looking back on the good times, but I would even take it a step further to say, what is your own personal mission statement? Like, are you able to live that out? Because if you are able to do that, even during the hard times, then that's probably a good sign that this is just one of those tough times you need to work through and maintain that resilience and kind of get to the other side or get to that peak after a valley, that kind of thing. If you're finding yourself not able to live out your mission and your values, why you're on this earth, if you can't do that at your place of employment, then that's probably a sign that there's going to be a lot harder times to come, right? And that doesn't mean to give up on you can still be resilient and choose that this isn't a great place to be. But I would say that's kind of helps you realize that you can stick it out during the hard times, or realize, no, this is foolish loyalty at this point. And maybe I'm not being resilient. I'm being stubborn to not look for something else. Cause case in point, let's, take my own personal mission statement of, in essence, I'm here to make other people successful, to help the people around me achieve success, whether that means removing roadblocks, et cetera. I've got a long 2 sentences about the reason I'm on earth. Well, if I can do that and I can help my coworkers, colleagues, companies we work with help them be successful, then I'm living that out. So even if there's a tough time, even if, business is stressful, whatever, well, that's something I'm kind of doing to achieve my mission and my vision, right? But if at some point I look around and I'm like, man, I cannot do this to the extent that I want to do this, I find myself years from now, John fires me and I go work for somewhere and I'm trying to live this out. I'm trying to support people and I am just being shut down by my boss by being able to help people. I'm going to be like, you know what? This is not somewhere I'm going to stay resilient because that's affecting my own personal reason for being on earth, if that makes sense. So I just think that it sounds cliche a little bit, but just that big picture mindset of, am I living out what I'm supposed to be living out in the midst of this, can help you get through that hard time, but can also help redirect you if that's not where you're supposed to be. So that'd be my tip about how to be resilient. But anything else before we're done?
One thing I thought of too, that I think we're all guilty of this, and it ties to resilience, but just be careful. I think we tend to compare our difficulties. And so every one of us on our team has lost a parent, in my case, both my parents. And Madeline and Tanner lost parents much too young. And so as an example, if Melissa lost your mom not too long ago, and Madeline could go, well, I lost my dad when I was a little child. So if you want real grief, and of course, she wouldn't say that. People say, well, I was a victim of sexual harassment or racial harassment, and that's nothing like getting laid off 3 times in a row. I think as human beings, we have to be real careful about that, because I think we kind of rank pain and suffering, and I think that's really hard because it is an individual thing. And I think in our society, we do kind of rank them sometimes. And I think as employees, with your peers, with your direct reports, with your family, just be careful to not say, well, if you think that was bad, this happened to me. And I think we all are guilty of that sometimes.
Yeah, and I would add to that too, John. Also be careful of the judgment that comes with that emotional ranking relative to things that you have not experienced. Because I worked with someone before that things that were happening in our lives was insignificant until they had to experience. And then it became real. And then it was like, oh, wow, I have a whole different level of empathy for you. So I just add that to it because, again, I've seen that happen before too.
Well, I think all that comes back to what we originally said about, us as a society, it being very easy for us to have that victim mentality. And if I can outrank you on my pain, I don't have to be resilient. I need everyone else to surround me and pick me up. And it's like, no, we're all struggling and we all need help. But we can all be resilient in the face of those issues. So thank you all for sharing your time and your perspective today. Hope our listeners got something from something that we said today. Thanks for tuning in, and we look forward to having you on next time.